on what Sam had to say. The American educator, I'm quoting Dr. Blumenfeld, the American educator is not interested in success. And the reason is because success causes a kind of disequilibrium in the system. In a hyper-democracy, the very concept of success has eventually to be eliminated because it's unfair to children whose parents are not attentive. And we have more and more of those all the time. I divide the world of American parents into two parts. Those who are busy and attentive, and those who are busy and inattentive. You are surely among the attentive. You are increasingly resented by those who are busy and inattentive. You care enough about your children to come out on a night like this when you could be listening to Barbara Bush. You are probably called names. I have been called a fundamentalist myself. I say, theologically, sir, it's not possible. I'm a Roman Catholic. Can be a fundamentalist, but it becomes increasingly necessary to keep you in your place, to put you down, because you're trying to do the right thing by your children, and it's become intolerable. Because so many others have lost their way, and they lost it under direction. They got a very bad roadmap, and I helped to draw it. And so I'm here to apologize for myself, for my colleagues Dave Maslow, Carl Rogers, and for some other younger Rogerian Maslowians, a man by the name of Dick Farson, whom I'm going to mention, and a fellow that we call Joe Blow, because although he does permit me to use his name, his story is so horrifying that I would prefer not to. But Joe has asked me to apologize to you as well. We drew a roadmap for you when you were going through college and graduate school as to how you could be the first generation of young parents in history no longer to oppress your children by telling them what you believe, but rather allow them to make their own minds up about the meaning of life, and your children have lost their way. And many of you suffer deeply for that, I know. You acted under direction. I'm going to be saying, teach your children what you love. Tell your children what to do. If we who love them refuse to tell them what to do, then we're only turning them over to those who have no reservations whatsoever about telling them what to buy. Come to where the flavor is. Come to Marlboro country. More children look for flavor in Marlboro country than any other, because they've seen it on thousands of billboards and in millions of magazines. And yet these are among the people at the Tobacco Institute, who have now gotten behind affective education with a multi-million-dollar open-ended grant to an educational agency called the National Association of State Boards of Education. To tell you that it's poor psychology to give your children direction in these times of rapid change. We have been hearing about living in times of rapid change now for almost 100 years. 1898, John Dewey came out with an article called The Primary Education Fetish, in which he said that just because the habit has been to teach language arts in the primary grades, for that reason we should not any longer. It is in education, if anywhere, Dewey said, that the present has its claims. And the theory on which we've been operating these last 30 years, if you can find how things have been done before, then do them the opposite. And the theory has finally come to be a good theory, because for the last 30 years, we've been doing these horrifying things to our children that Dr. Blumenfeld talked about, and it's time to do the opposite. I mean, he didn't even mention geography. 32% of American youngsters, I read in that study released about 9 months ago, 32% of American youngsters think that Finland is a desert country. And the theory of experiential learning says that they'll have to find out for themselves whether it is or not. It might be. If they go there looking for palm trees and desert sand and get caught instead in a blizzard, then maybe for them it's not a desert country after all. But they have to learn. We cannot tell them. Because after all, we grew up in times when the rules were very different. And because they were different, they were wrong. And the reason they were wrong is because the existentialists of our era say that they're wrong. We have to live in the here and now. Here's why kids aren't learning geography. This is a book. I put a brown paper cover on it because Joe Blow wrote it. I showed it recently on TV, and my wife said, you really shouldn't have done that. I know he says it's okay, but it's embarrassing for all of us. It's embarrassing at our house because we had Joe to our house back in the late 60s when he was into, as they said, into Roderianism and working on this book. And we published it. Carl Rogers and I, between 1968 and 1973, turned out for the Charles E. Merrill Publishing Company, a major textbook firm in Ohio, 17 volumes advocating what Sam and I are here to destroy tonight. And Joe paid a terrible price for what we taught him and then what he taught others. If he weren't a Christian now, he'd be racked by guilt, but he believes that he's forgiven. The Lord caught up with him in prison, where Joe went as part of his program of personal liberation and personal growth. He was a high official in the Carter administration in the Department of Education, as a matter of fact, responsible for a budget of $6 million at that time. May have taught some of your older children, or taught the teachers of your older children, because he was in charge of the gifted and talented for the whole country. Didn't need the money, but as an extracurricular growth program for himself, began pimping in the evening in the Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C., in the name of personal growth. Found an attractive young woman who was willing to have herself advertised in an underground newspaper in Northern Virginia, as willing to pose, alone or with partner, for gentle, sincere men. They meant fellow humanists. Well, for all of Joe's brains, and they are considerable, he wasn't too smart because he forgot to figure that the Vice Squad would read the ads in the underground press, and they did, and they came and they arrested him, and they arrested the woman, and they charged Joe with pimping and prostitution and selling marijuana and offering oral sex to one of the vice officers, which Joe insists he did not do, though he admits that he did everything else. Selling pornographic pictures, including pictures of bestiality. All done by Joe in the name of personal growth. It was what he hadn't tried before. It was certainly what his parents hadn't wanted him to try, and for that reason, the theory said he must. So Joe's book, if you have to look at it, I'm probably tempting you. You all want to come up and see what's under it. If you come up, I'll show it. If you get the book, you'll find a great example of what went wrong. And Joe apologizes. He said, you know, the West Coast humanists, he was an East Coast humanist, he said, you West Coast humanists push change on us all the time, the importance of getting on the program of constant change in the late 60s and the 70s. He said, when I went to prison and found Christ, he said, I learned then that you weren't interested in change because I wrote to all my West Coast humanist friends. And I told them this marvelous, liberating change in my life. I had been set free. And he said, you weren't interested. Then I understood that it's change only in a certain direction. Only change away from decency. Only change away from what made the country great. Those are the changes that they're talking about. So when you hear the programs that your kids are being put through here in the state of Michigan being defended in those terms, that we live in times of rapid change, and you cannot hold on to your children forever, and you cannot be with them to make their decisions for them. Mom and Dad, you have to let them go. You really don't know what you're talking about. Please don't try to tell your children what to do. When you hear all of that, know that there's only one kind of change that they're interested in, and that is change away from decency. Or if we could think of other words that they wouldn't like, words like virtue, wholesomeness, change away from those things too. The unspeakable words of modern American public school education. Why are the kids doing so badly in geography? In addition to all those other things that Dr. Blumenfeld named. Joe Blow had a section in his 1971 book on geography. He called it the geography of the self. Here's the kinds of exercises that kids go through. Some of you are young enough to have gone through them yourself, and your children are going through them tomorrow and the next day. I've looked at the Michigan model a number of the years. They're going through this kind of thing, not this very thing, but things like this in the classrooms of Michigan. Here's Joe's instructions to the student of geography. Take a fantastic voyage, an exploration trip over your body. A group of tiny explorers, a Lewis and Clark expedition over your body. What would their journal be like? Write an imaginary journal of their discoveries. This is what the kids are doing instead of geography. 67% of our children, we're told, don't know where Southeast Asia is. Our longest war was fought there. They can't find it on a map or a globe. They're doing the geography of the self, taking trips over their body. If your body were a continent, writes Joe, where would your rivers be? Your population centers, your mountain ranges, your cliffs, your caves. Dr. Wasilewski will join me as a psychologist in understanding the deeper Freudian meanings of these questions. Where are your mountain ranges, your cliffs, your caves? What are the chief products of your body continent? Natural resources, materials for production, energy centers, power plants, recreation lakes and parks. Take an odyssey into your inner space. How big is the inside of your head? Get a sense of your message network. What's coming in and what's going out? Oh, poo. Poo, that reminds me of the name of a program that I've been looking at for the Alabama Family Alliance called Teenage Health Teaching Module. It is a comprehensive health education program, something of a parallel to your own Michigan model of comprehensive school health education. It is the Educational Development Center in Newton, Massachusetts, which puts this program out since 1980, is sponsored in part by the Seagram's distilleries. And they put out a drug education program which begins to look like it don't work. But that's the point, for it not to work. We're not sure because the Centers for Disease Control is supposed to have released the research on it, and they're holding it up. And I suspect they're holding it up because they want to delay the bad news until they can figure out a way to make it sound like good news. The kids are making choices, folks. They're choosing to do drugs. And the module in the Teenage Health Teaching modules for drug education is called POO, Protecting Oneself and Others. At EDC they call it POO, and I do too. You have a program here in the state of Michigan. It was pilot tested here, the one that comes from Ohio, from Granville, called Quest. In Plymouth Canton Township, for example, they have Quest Skills for Living in the high school for special education. They have Skills for Adolescents in the middle school. I understand a required course for all the students. And they would have had Skills for Growing in the elementary school this year, as the director of elementary education for that district told me, except that too many Michigan educators had lined up to take part in the Skills for Growing program, and they couldn't get in. So they had to settle for the Michigan model of comprehensive health education. Quest, the organization which puts out these free skills programs, is the country's preeminent success story in affective education. And for the last 5 years, Quest has been sitting on research which, if they would have released it, would have persuaded us that this kind of education is a crock, because it does the opposite of what any loving parent, and I have to say any good teacher or any responsible administrator, or even the people from the Department of Mental Health, it does the opposite of what any of these good people want. It leads children to do drugs. The country's largest independently purveyed program of drug education, Quest Skills for Adolescents, leads children to do drugs. And they've known that at Quest for 5 years. But they have self-esteem. Because they have self-esteem, they know that anything they do, because they've chosen to do it, has to be good. And so if you wouldn't understand that, if you wouldn't understand the mysterious way in which their program is very good for kids, even when it deals with drugs, they're not going to tell you about it, because you would misjudge them. And they don't misjudge themselves. They judge themselves very high indeed. And this is what you're going to be confronting with your children. They will come home, as the little 8-year-old boy in 2nd grade in Longview, Washington did recently, and having misbehaved in some way in the household and having heard a correction from his mother or father, put his hands over his ears and said, "I have my rights, I have my rights." And they called the school and said, "What's going on?" And they said, "We have Quest in the school." And the father in Cincinnati, whose child is in a program you also have here in Michigan called Project Charlie, whose 9-year-old came home and said, "I'm not taking out the kitty litter anymore." And Dad said, "Well, that's interesting. Why not?" "Because I've chosen not to." Your schools are in love with the theory of choice. And it has to be subjective choice, because if it's objective, then the standard is more available to some children than others. Some are naturally more acute, and even worse from a hyper-democratic perspective. Some of them have you for parents and not the others. And you care and you push your kids. And you make sure that they don't make choices so much as make right choices. And you help them to understand that there are certain things about which there is no choice. The school helps them to understand that in many areas. For example, if you have Pop Warner football, the coach doesn't let the children choose whether or not to wear helmets. If he did, some of them would choose not to. A kind of macho posturing. Driver's ed never lets the children choose which side of the road they prefer to drive on. The principal never points out his automobile in the parking lot and says, "I want you to decide whether or not to vandalize my car." Here's how you decide. First, you identify the problem, then you consider the alternatives, then you predict the consequences, then you make a decision, and then you evaluate your decision. He doesn't do that with his automobile. But he does it with drugs and sex. The dominant method of drug and sex education in this country, as in this state, is non-directive decision-making, in which the children are told to consider the alternatives. which is only a good idea if they're already misbehaving. Then they ought to consider that there is an alternative to misbehaving. But what of your children who have learned an absolute morality, who have learned what they must never do and what they must always do, and who think that's pretty fine, and who see how far it's carried them? They're reading before they even come to school. They're not guessing about words. They know the sounds of words because it's been given to them to know. You've given them a great deal by way of objective standards. And they come to class and they find out on the first day of kindergarten that they're going to learn to make decisions about drugs. And when they get to the method, they find out that the second step of all these methods is to consider the alternatives. Okay, that's what your mom and dad have told you, but what are the alternatives? And precisely because you've reared your children to be obedient, precisely for that reason are they now at risk. You've taught them to respect legitimate authority, and they respect the authority of the school. And they say, there's something my mom and dad didn't tell me. They didn't tell me about my rights to be a decision maker. Mom and Dad, you betrayed me, if truth be told. There's a better way. I can make my own choices. And at that point, the Tobacco Institute understands that its investment in the affective education movement has already paid off, because if children, in their inexperience and inability to control their impulses, are permitted to make choices of drugs, a certain percentage of them will choose badly. And then when the teachers are explicitly instructed not to be judgmental, not to use words like right and wrong except with this gesture, quote-unquote right, quote-unquote wrong. The gesture called skeptical quotation marks, which says, I don't want you to think that I think that there are such things. When your teachers are told to be non-judgmental, then your children don't know that they've made the wrong decision. And so we have in the Quest program, we put out a newsletter a couple of weeks ago, and Phyllis Schlafly recently reprinted it in the Education Reporter for August. We have the following appalling statistics on the Quest Middle School program, Skills for Adolescents. We have, for marijuana hashish, the following finding. This comes from an internal memorandum from the research department at Quest, which has never been released, but which was smuggled out to me, and I can vouch for its authenticity, and Quest doesn't even deny its authenticity. For marijuana/hashish, increased lifetime and 30-day use reported by the experimental subjects. Those are the kids in the program. These are the kids in the Michigan model. If your kids have Michigan model, if they have problem solving for people, they are what this report calls experimentals. They are experimenting on your children. And I would be very surprised if the experiment had one chance in a million of working out well, because all the evidence is against it, and the latest is this research from Quest. Increased use reported by experimental, small decrease reported by the control subjects. They tested kids before the Quest program, and they tested the control kids. The control kids didn't have the program, and then they post-tested them. They did the experimental intervention with the Quest kids. That is, they gave them the program, Skills for Adolescents. They did not tell their mothers and fathers that the covert co-sponsor of this program happens to be R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, as it is. Reynolds gave $278,000 to Quest. It's a very important age range, the middle school age range for the tobacco companies. They give the kids the Skills for Adolescents program that Reynolds helped pay for, and then at the end of the program, they again test the kids in the control group and the kids in the experimental Quest group. And the key questions are, what about drugs? We already know you like the program. My goodness, you get to sit around in circles and not do physics for an hour. We know that teachers like it because they get to be psychiatrists without going to medical school. 3 days to a new career in psychiatry. It's called Quest training. But what about behavior? What's the position of you kids with respect to your actual drug-using behavior? And here we find that the kids who go through the Quest program show striking changes. Here's one of these striking changes. Among the Quest kids, quote, the perception is of lower risk for experimentation and regular use of marijuana and hashish. In other words, if I'm doing it, and I've come to understand how valuable I am, not because God made me, because we can't talk about that, in Christ it is, after all, a public school, but if I am valuable just because I'm me, then if I do this thing, if I choose to do drugs, then it can't be dangerous, because I'm not stupid. If the most important thing is self-evaluation, your kids are a pushover for anybody who has something to sell them, because the alarms that go off in good children on the basis of what their parents have told them to watch out for are no longer available to them, and they use. Cigarettes, this is the payoff for the sponsor. Increased use in the last 30 days. They asked the kids, have you used cigarettes in the last year? Have you used them in the last 30 days? They didn't find any significant statistical difference between the two in lifetime use, but they did in 30-day use. A much greater increase for the Quest kids. They learned how to smoke in the Quest course. Apparent perception of lower risk from heavy cigarette usage between pre- and post-test for the experimental group. The control group scores are virtually unchanged. In other words, the Quest kids have learned that cigarette smoking isn't dangerous. Well, there's the payoff for the sponsor. Alcohol, striking increase in reported use in lifetime and past 30 days for the experimental group. Little change in the control group. Expression of decreased risk from alcohol use by the experimental group, stable for the control group. All of these things are worth going over precisely because they're so detailed, and they replicate what's been found ever since research has been done on the kind of education that Carl Rogers and I had a hand in having had back in the 60s. Dick Farson, I mentioned Dick's apology. He said recently to the newspaper in San Diego, he said, I was so arrogant. I had my PhD. He, like myself, like Thomas Gordon, the founder of Parent Effectiveness Training, had all studied with Carl Rogers. And we really thought, well, Carl Rogers was a wonderful human being. Some called him a saint. His mistake was to listen to his followers. He listened to his followers on the Farson principle. Here's Dick Farson writing an article. Tomorrow is the 21st anniversary of the beginning of the end. The most recent beginning of the end for American education happened on the 6th of September 1969 when Dick Farson wrote an article for Saturday Review, beginning on page 20. It's worth reading, looking it up in the library. How could anything that feels so bad be so good? And what he's fundamentally talking about is what we used to call misconduct. How can anything that troubles my conscience so much be so good? And the answer really is because it troubles your conscience. Because we know you're not supposed to have one. Because your conscience, in the Rogerian view, is nothing but your parental superego. These are your folks that you carry around with you. They're always on your back telling you what to do, and they don't know what to do because they didn't grow up in the modern era. They grew up in an era when everything was simpler. Don't listen to your folks. Get rid of the conscience. So Dick Farson writes in the Saturday Review, September 6, 1969, to put it simply, today's young people probably know more than their elders. Wisdom and culture have always been transmitted from the older generation to the younger. Now, for perhaps the first time in history, there is a reversal of that process. Young people used to want to be like their elders. Today, it's the other way around. And if you remember 1969, that's right. We were all into the youth culture in that era. And who it's killing is the youth. Let me just end with a little story about that. And I hope we get a chance to talk some, and I get a chance to talk to you in the discussion period. But let me tell you a sad story about a youth who died because his parents bought in, not just to the youth culture, not just the gold chains and the shirt unbuttoned to the waist and all of that, but the essence of the youth culture, which was non-judgmentalism and do your own thing. Here's Joe Blow in his preface telling what happened to him. The important thing in most of my formative years was to, quote, develop character. And I never really questioned that value. From that place, I have traveled across the spectrum. The spectrum began with his father, a career military officer who wanted his son to follow in his footsteps, but to go farther, as most loving parents have always done. That's why we call what we do ethnopsychology, because most of the ethnics in this country and previous generations came here for a better life for their children. But they wouldn't even know what it was unless they began on the same path that their parents trod and then trod it farther than their parents. So Joe's assignment in his youth was to become a military man, to carry a military bearing, to succeed at whatever he did, to defend his country, to defend the defenseless of his country. And he followed that program. From that place, I have traveled across the spectrum to now, where I now pretty much agree with what the late Fritz Perls, the father of Gestalt therapy, has to say about character. And here he quotes Fritz Perls. Once you have character, you have developed a rigid system. Your behavior becomes petrified, predictable, and you lose your ability to cope freely with the world with all your resources. You are predetermined to cope just with events in just one way, namely as your character prescribed. So it seems a paradox, writes Fritz Perls, when I say that the richest person, the most productive, creative person is a person who has no character. In our society, we demand a person to have character, and especially good character, because then you are predictable and you can be pigeonholed. Folks, things have changed. If Fritz Perls was describing the way things were when he wrote that, let's see, when did he write that? In 1969, they aren't that way anymore. Your kids are not supposed to have character because it's a measure of their creativity that they can improvise, and especially that they can be different from you, especially if you are religious, especially if you are churchgoers. As a researcher in the field of drug education, I can tell you that the best protection that children have against precocious sex or drug use of any kind is church-going. And the second most important is participation in organized sports. The research is very consistent on that. The problem with both of those is that they build character. And while the children are willing to tolerate character built in sports, they're not so willing any longer to follow your path to the church. Today, the measure of success for your youngsters is their ability to improvise. And you parents are being persuaded to back off and let the schools do their work, which is to pervade among your children the same product in morality that Sam has indicted them as having pervaded in academics, namely illiteracy. And so, the parents of young Tim take a course from Carl Rogers and me in 1968. We were team teaching at a university in Southern California, a course called Values and Decision Making. And the parents are studying to be psychologists, and they get the message, and they rear their kids according to Rogerian principles, not knowing that Carl Rogers did not rear his according to Rogerian principles. When his son came home from school with less than perfect grades, he said, in effect, no son of mine is going to get less than perfect grades. And when Abe Maslow's daughter didn't want to apply to the college of her father's choice, he locked her in the bedroom until she did. And she said, I screamed and pounded on the door, and then I applied to the college of my father's choice. And she said, then he said, dear, you don't have to go there. But he said, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. And if I don't believe that the Lord God is God, I certainly don't believe that my daughter is. My dear, you have limits, and I am one of them. And she said, I reared my own child that way. But the parents of Tim, who was 5 years old when his parents took our course in the summer of '68, knew none of that. And they thought their job was to empathize with their child, to practice active listening, to use iMessages and no-lose problem solving, and let the boy find his own way. He was a slow bloomer, didn't date in high school, wondered what that might have meant, was approached by a predecessor of Project 10 in California, that's the homosexual recruitment group in Southern California, approached by a predecessor gang of Project 10 with the suggestion that he had a sexual orientation. There's no such thing as a slow bloomer. If you don't like girls, you probably like boys, and you're just repressing it. So he came to his folks knowing that they were good counselors to talk it over. But the measure of their goodness as counselors was to reflect back to him his confusion, as Carl Rogers did with his clients, though never with those whom he loved. And they said, sounds like you're feeling pretty confused right now. Sounds like you're really wondering if you might be gay. And he breathed a sigh of relief, because this stuff works. It does relieve the burden of carrying an unexpressed feeling around. Having had his feeling heard and accepted, he went out and decided that he was gay. 5 years later, he was dead 5 years later at the age of 22 for me. And when I saw the article in the paper, because his folks wanted to go public, and I asked his mama, was he gay, because the article didn't say so, and she said, yeah, he was. And I said, did it have anything to do with her class? And she said, well, I'm afraid it did. It's interesting that you should ask. Yes, it had something to do with our class. We learned in that class that the best, most loving thing we can do for our children is to allow them to make their own choices. It would be a program that could be considered only in a world in which everybody had agreed to allow children to make their own choices. Your children are being persuaded that that is their fundamental right to make their own choices in a world in which you are at the same time being propositioned to take a parent effectiveness course or a parent training course paid for by the Tobacco Institute, in which you'll learn to back off just like Tim's folks did. And everybody else is selling like crazy. We must tell our children what to do. Thank you.